Key findings of HEPI Student Academic Experience Survey in 2023. More students are struggling with the cost of living and feel lonely. Student well-being has improved but remains worse than the rest of the population. HEPI's first ever Student Academic Experience Survey. What were you doing in 2006? Studying, working, in the same job as now, recovering, looking after someone, perhaps not yet born? That's the year that the Higher Education Policy Institute, HEPI, ran its first ever Student Academic Experience Survey, SAES, hot on the heels of the first ever National Student Survey, NSS, in 2005. The NSS differs from the SAES in that it surveys only higher education students in their final year of an undergraduate degree or other course, whereas the SAES takes account of the views of students from all years of undergraduate and relevant courses. While there is some overlap, the NSS, as its title suggests, is more about levels of satisfaction with what a university or college has provided, whereas the SAES is more focused on the academic experience students are having, asking questions about the number of assignments students complete, perceptions about how long it takes academics to mark these assignments, student well-being and access to support services, and student perceptions of value for money. There are of course many more surveys and reviews conducted by higher education providers themselves and also by other organizations, for example AdvanceHE, with whom HEPI partners on the SAES, and who themselves run student engagement surveys especially for postgraduate courses. Taken together, the student surveys provide valuable data for staff and students alike, helping organizations make improvements to their courses, supporting prospective students in choosing where to go to study and furnishing policymakers with evidence for their broader decision-making. Worrying statistics now in its 17th year, many of the questions have stayed the same throughout, enabling analysis of longitudinal trends. New questions are introduced from time to reflect current thinking. Student well-being questions, for example, were first introduced in 2014. And there is some good news on this theme in the 2023 results. After a nationwide slump during the pandemic years, student well-being scores have risen this year, but they do remain stubbornly lower than for the general population, so still an area of concern. Another worrying statistic this year is that 1/4 of all students feel lonely most of the time, and that those studying for qualifications like Higher National Diplomas or certificates, foundation degrees, and apprenticeships feel lonelier than those completing bachelor or integrated master's degrees. It will come as no surprise that fewer and fewer students, 42% this year compared with 53% last year and 58% 2 years ago, say that their maintenance loan or grant covers most of their living costs as loans and grants fail to keep up with inflation. This year, 14% of students stated that paid employment is their main source of funds. The data show that it is students from less affluent backgrounds who are most adversely affected by the rising cost of living, and that non-binary students, and female students to a lesser but still significant extent, LGBT+ and disabled students also rely disproportionately on maintenance loans as their main source of funds for their time at college. Effects of the cost of living crisis for students. While many students are working more hours to cope with the rise in the cost of living, 7% of care-experienced students state that their living costs are mostly funded by bank loans compared with 3% of the whole population. The only silver lining here is that 18% of care-experienced students state that their living costs are mostly covered by scholarships, positive testimony for the organizations that have done sterling work in this area. Relating cost of living to academic studies, 3/4 of students said that their studies had been affected by the cost of living crisis, and 1/4 said their studies had been affected a lot, and again, it is marginalized and disadvantaged groups who are most affected, which risks entrenching inequality through higher education rather than combating it. Student surveys have gained much more traction in the UK since most students have paid fees for their courses, but even in situations where students haven't paid fees, such as Scottish students attending Scottish universities, or who have paid much lower fees than the average, surveys have become the norm as part of accountability processes. The Student Academic Experience Survey tells us exactly what students are thinking at that moment in time as the world around them keeps changing. It's always very topical. Dr. Joan O'Mahony, Deputy Principal, Bloomsbury Institute, London. Conclusion on SAES. The SAES is a fabulous way for individual institutions, and the education sector overall, to look at trends over time. Any higher education establishment can ask for its own data, looking at its own students' perspectives over time as well as benchmarking against others. It will be very interesting to see the trends in the results of the SAES over the next 17 years, during which time we expect the number of UK students to increase dramatically, partly because so many people want to study at a higher level, a boon for the sector, but also because of demographic trends. There was a UK birth bulge in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, meaning that as many as 350,000 more university places may be needed, the equivalent of 50 universities of Manchester, by 2035. Can the higher education sector step up to that challenge? By Lucy Hare and Rose Stevenson. Rose Stevenson, Director of Policy and Advocacy, Higher Education Policy Institute, HEPI. Lucy Hare, Director of Partnerships,